Hello, Water Loss Technical Assistance Program participants. This is Kate Gasner. I'm one of the project management team, and I am going to be walking through some of the content that we've reviewed in the first workshops. You may have attended and would like to review what we taught. You may have missed Wave 1 workshops and would like to catch up to our current activity. So the following recorded content is going to do just that. We'll review what we covered in Wave 1 in a relatively condensed format. The first chapter, the first segment, is going to cover the foundations of water auditing, cover the main tenets of M36, and go over an introduction to that methodology. The first question we want to address here is defining what a water audit is. And secondly, we'll dive into the details of the information the water audit asks of us. What information do we have to supply the water audit? The first question in defining what a water audit is, what purpose does the water audit serve? Here are three main benefits of completing a water audit. First and foremost, we estimate the volume of water loss in our system. And we do that by accounting for all known water volumes that go into and leave our distribution system. We know that every volume of water that enters our distribution system has to either go to an authorized use, customer use, operational use, all of the known uses that we have in all throughout our system, or if it's not contained in one of those uses, it's quote-unquote lost in a couple of different ways. And we want to define exactly where our water is going. So the water audit serves as an accounting process of those volumes. Secondly, we evaluate the data source reliability. We understand that in accounting for those volumes, there's going to be elements of uncertainty. Our instruments will introduce some amount of error. We'll have less confidence in some of our data sources. So alongside this estimation of water loss, we want to hold this idea of uncertainty and try to grapple with how that manifests in the results. And lastly, the water audit gives us some common language to communicate water distribution efficiency. So we'll talk a bit about performance indicators and how to talk about water losses that is both fair to your system and acknowledges that all systems do leak a certain amount, but is also realistic and accurate in communicating water losses in your distribution system. First, the water balance. The water balance is the concept, it's the methodology that's behind the water audit. I'll reference the water audit as the software tool, the actual process of entering volumes into the software, whereas the water balance is the concept behind it. And as you can see, the water balance is a process by which we account for known volumes to understand our water losses. The known volumes we have here are water supplied, all of the water that we supply into our system, authorized consumption, which comes in very many different forms, billed, unbilled, metered, unmetered. And once we have a sense of all of those inputs and all of those authorized outputs, we're then left with an understanding of water loss. So in this graphic, as you can see here, we've got a column that represents water supplied, and each preceding column towards the right, as we continue along the right, represents an equivalent to that water supplied volume. So we start with an understanding of all the production that goes into our system, all of the imports, all of the well production, all of the treatment plant production, everything that hits our distribution system. And it's our job to allocate that volume into known categories of water use or water loss. So we do that over here in authorized consumption in all these different forms of authorized use, whether billed or unbilled, metered or unmetered. And in that process, we then have, in that process of elimination, we are left over with a sum total of water losses. The main points of this process is that no water is left unaccounted for. In fact, that's an outdated term that we don't use anymore. This makes sure that we do indeed account for all water. And as you can tell, the results we're interested in, those water loss volumes, are highly dependent on the accuracy of our other volume determinations. So that's why we'll stress the accuracy and error appreciation when we're calculating volumes like water supplied and authorized consumption, because any results that the water audit shows will be directly dependent on our appreciation of error in these other volumes, given that it's a process of elimination. Once we do that comparison of inputs, of system input volume to authorized consumption, we're left with a total volume of water loss. And we know that that total volume is composed of two very different volumes. One of those volumes is apparent losses. Those are all of the losses that occur at the point of water transfer to the customer. You've done your job as a utility. Water is used by a customer, but the quote-unquote loss is introduced because we lose track of the water. We aren't paid for it. This comes in a couple different forms. We've got meters that don't capture all of the water that passes through them. That's one form of apparent loss. Again, the customer uses it, but we aren't paid for it. There's no revenue associated with that use. Another form is flat out theft. A customer uses water and very deliberately doesn't pay for it. That's a type of apparent loss. And then sometimes we introduce complications and error in our billing processes and our handling of data. We call that systematic data handling error. And that can introduce a form of apparent loss where we're losing track of water. And so we don't get paid for it as utilities. The other form of water loss that we want to distinguish in our total water loss volume is the physical loss, the leakage that happens all throughout our distribution system. That can come in a variety of different forms, but it's important to acknowledge that this is a volume of water, a tangible physical volume of water that is withdrawn from our system and never gets to a customer. As you can imagine, it's really important to distinguish between these two types of losses because they're very different in nature and they require very different intervention strategies. For apparent losses, we're talking about meter accuracy and meter replacement and meter testing and protocols of theft, understanding and monitoring. Whereas for real losses, we're talking about questions of leak detection and monitoring carefully what's happening underground in our distribution systems. We're talking about issues of pressure and repairs and repair crews. So it's really important, given how different these two volumes and their solutions are, their interventions are, it's really important we get to know these two volumes separately. Again, one of our other jobs in pursuing a water audit is to understand how good our data is. We can't take action on the results of an audit unless we grapple with how good the audit results are. So here are some questions that we really like to consider in determining these volumes that the water audit asks for. For every volume, let's work with production volume or water supplied. We want to ask whether it's complete. Do we have all of the data for the audit period for a whole year, reflecting the volume, in this case, that was input into our system? Is it consistent? Is there any reason for suspicion of the data's accuracy? And lastly, do we have any proof of its accuracy? Have we tested the data sources in any way? Can we confidently say that this data is right and reflects the volumes that entered our distribution system? This is a great example just on the screen of a case where we would be somewhat suspicious of whether this volume, this total production value was complete. If I got monthly data that looked like this, I'd scratch my head a bit and say, what happened in May? Either our plant went offline, and I want to make sure that that was actually the case, or we're missing a sizable chunk of data here. That's where the question, does the data story make sense? For each volume that the audit asks of us, we want to ask questions of the data to understand whether we're working with the right numbers and therefore getting a good understanding of our water losses in the end. Lastly, we want to communicate water distribution efficiency through our water audit. That's the real beauty of the water audit, is once we develop good data and are using the water audit as a real tool of management and efficiency tracking, we have a standard language to use around how much water we're losing in our system and what potential goals might be. So customized performance indicators are part of the water audit software, and we'll start to appreciate how much our water losses cost us as a really important step in understanding what we might do about those water losses. In fact, the water audit presents the results, presents water losses in 3 different ways. First, we talk about volumes, absolute volumes. How much water in million gallons or acre feet are you losing to real losses? And similarly, how much water are you losing to apparent losses? We can then convert with some cost information about how much water is valued at your utility. Literally, what is its value in terms of production cost and what is its value in terms of retail customer cost. We can translate those volumes into values. And that gets really powerful when we can say, this water loss, this real loss, for example, our leakage is costing us X dollars. We then have an understanding of the potential benefit in reducing that volume. And so then with that cost figure, we can start talking about interventions much more realistically and cost effectively. Lastly, the water audit gives us a really great metric of validity to start understanding how confidently and how accurately we can regard the results. So as we'll be going over in this whole process of the technical assistance program, we'll be really focusing on an element of the water audit software called the data validity scores. And those characterize how good your data is, how well you are maintaining data sources, how strictly you're adhering to some of the best practices in maintaining and keeping up good data. That's going to be really important because if and when we get to a result, our water audit is complete and we see that we have so much million gallons of water loss, the next question is, how accurate is that assessment? So this understanding of validity, what data sources went into that assessment and how good those data sources are, that's going to be key in understanding how much we can trust our results and how much those results should inform any action or investment going forward. What we'll do next is go over a few of the main volumes that the water audit asks of you. I'll address some of the bigger volumes, the water supplied volume, the authorized consumption volume, and then what remains, the water losses. It's important to recognize that each of those volumes is composed of a variety of different subvolumes, and we'll address that a bit. But to each his own in this process, each utility is going to have a matrix of different subvolumes depending on your setup. So it's important that you investigate your setup and you have an understanding of how these more theoretical volumes apply to your system and what data you should be looking out for. First, water supplied. I'll take a pause here to note that water supplied is one of the most important volumes of the water audit. Water supplied represents all of the water that is input into your distribution system to serve your customers. This means it's the collection of all of the volume that you produce, whether in a treatment plant or from a groundwater well, in addition to all the water that you purchase, the water imported. And it subtracts all of the wholesale exports that are not meant for your customers, but are indeed sold to a neighboring agency or another another water municipality. In that regard, when we take inputs and we subtract those exports, we're left with the water supplied volume, all of the potable treated water that's input into the distribution system to serve your customers. And this volume is super important because it serves as the basis of the whole analysis. This is our what we regard as 100%. This is the whole. And our job now is to allocate and distribute that whole volume and understand how much of our water supplied gets paid for, gets delivered to customers, is used for operations, and then finally, what isn't paid for, what is lost in our accounting and what is lost physically from our distribution systems. Because again, the water audit process is one of a process of elimination, getting this first volume, this foundational volume, as accurate as possible is critical to the success of the rest of our process. One of the first sub-volumes of water supplied is an assessment of all the volumes that you own and operate. Usually this consists of some groundwater and some surface water. And the main questions to consider when determining this volume, again, you're looking at all of the volume you produced at your supply sources over the course of the whole audit period year, whatever year you're looking at to assess these volumes. So over the course of that year, you want to identify which sources of data are relevant to the year. If I'm looking at 2015, for example, and I have both a treatment plant that treats a nearby lake and a number of groundwater wells, I want to look at all of my records and see which of these sources were active during 2015, and more specifically, which meters captured which flows. So I want to inventory all of the inputs that hit my distribution system and understand which meters were responsible for tracking that volume. We say here, where are the meters? Because it's important to remember that data is generated from these physical processes. Meters are instruments that are tangible and real, and even getting eyes on meters can be an important process of evaluating their reliability. We see a lot of meters that aren't set up for success because they come just after a bend or they're placed really close to a pump. So it's important to qualify the quality of data that comes from a meter that's not set up for success, and understanding where they are and which volumes they're tracking is a key part of that. So one of the first things we encourage you to do in determining water supplied is simply mapping out where are your meters, what volumes do they track, what types of meters are they, and how are they set up. That's a great first step. We're going to want to do the same thing for any water that we purchase. In this case, understanding exactly where the meter is or what type of meter is it or how it's set up may be a little more difficult given that you likely don't own or operate that meter. But maybe you do have access to it. The main point here is that we want to do our best to understand where this data is coming from. If you can look at all beyond the bill that you get for the volume you purchase, that's ideal. And lastly, we want to do a similar thing for all of the bulk water exports that we conduct. Again, which meters are responsible for tracking those exports? How is it tracked? If by chance there's not a meter at that connection, how do you account for that water exchange? And how good is that meter? How do you know, or rather, how have you paid attention to, how much care have you given that meter to date? There's a spot in the water audit software that acknowledges that not all master meters are perfect, and it allows for some correction. So we want to take full advantage of that correction. It does require some engagement with your understanding of meter accuracy. So if you have volumetric accuracy testing, what we can do is acknowledge that if our meter is under registering, for example, then we haven't accounted for all of the water that is input into your system if we just take the meters reads. Instead, we want to account for that under registration, that missed volume, and add it back to our assessment of total water supplied. That's going to be a hard estimation to make unless you have very specific test results. So proceed with caution when using the master meter error adjustment, but know that we do want to make adjustments if we have that information. Generally, for the data validity score, that assessment of data quality that will rank for each of our inputs, for the data validity score and just for a general appreciation of the data quality here, we do want to evaluate not only what are these meters telling us, but how good is that data. And two of the ways we can check in on the quality of that data, one is electronic calibration, and the second is volumetric accuracy testing. When someone asks you, do you test your meters, that's actually a relatively vague question. Electronic calibration is often commonly interchangeable with the language quote-unquote testing, but it's important to acknowledge that electronic calibration actually only investigates how good the secondary electronics are, the secondary devices are on any meter. To electronically calibrate a meter, what you're doing is making sure that the translation of meter read to data signal is all good. And that is important, and we want that translation to be as accurate as possible. But even a highly and well-tuned calibration, a well-tuned secondary device, doesn't guarantee that the meter itself, the measuring mechanism, is measuring water accurately. So that's where volumetric accuracy testing comes in, and that's a really important and separate piece of the puzzle when we're examining our meter's accuracy overall. That's where we pass a known volume through a meter, or we introduce another meter and compare the reads to get an understanding of how is the meter's mechanism working? Is it capturing all of the volume that passes through it? With a full understanding of water supplied and an understanding of how good that data is, we're going to move on to the next biggest volume that the water audit asks of us. It's the assessment of authorized consumption. As we know, authorized consumption comes in a variety of different forms. We've got some authorized consumption that is billed and metered. Other authorized consumption is neither billed nor metered, and every permutation in between. Our end goal, our ultimate goal, is to understand how much water was used over the course of the audit period for all intentional purposes, so all authorized and approved purposes. Our secondary, our parallel goal in this, of course, is to understand how good our data is, how good are we at tracking all of these different uses. So first, one of the biggest volumes that we have to determine is this billed metered authorized consumption. For a good deal of Californian utilities, most of our customers have meters associated with their, or in line with their service connections. So most of our customers will see, will qualify under this type of consumption. There's both a bill generated for them and there's a meter associated with their read. When we're defining billed metered authorized consumption, our main data source is going to be the billing data. That's where we keep track of all of our revenue generating bills, and it's also where we keep track of all our meter reads. So it's an inventory of volumes exchanged throughout the course of the year. It's really good. Our billing database is really good at a lot of things, of keeping track of a ton of information. But when we ask it to produce one accurate summary value of all the water our customers used that was billed for and metered, that gets tricky. Then the stakes are a little high, and all of that information that we've been tracking in the billing data is hard pressed to be consolidated and accurately reflected in one summary value. And that's what the audit software asks you to do. It just has one input for all of the billed, metered, authorized consumption. So we'll encourage you to be critical and careful when doing that query or that export of billing data. We encourage you to sink your teeth into the raw data and slice and dice it as much as possible to make sure that you are only looking at the right records and that those records reflect the volume used by your customers. That requires you to do a couple things. It requires you to confirm that you haven't double counted any consumption. There are no duplicate records, for example, that you haven't mistakenly included non-potable water, so there's no raw water distribution in there, there's no recycled water accounts in there. It requires that you've made sure to clean away any financial adjustments that don't have to do with volumes exchanged, because we're really interested in the volume here, and sometimes our billing processes can muddy a little bit of that pure volume determination. We don't want to forget also that other authorized consumption exists throughout our system. Not all of the water we use for intended purposes is billed nor metered. So we've got a couple other uses we want to acknowledge and properly account for in the water audit. Some other authorized consumption uses range from district use. Sometimes we've got arrangements with other district facilities such that they are metered but maybe not billed. We have examples of operational uses that are neither billed nor metered. Flushing, for instance, whether for quality or just after a repair, that's not going to be metered, and it's definitely not going to generate revenue for the utility. So that's an example of a use that we'll have to estimate. We want to acknowledge that it happens. We want to associate a volume to it, but we'll estimate it given we don't have any instrument tracking exactly what we've used for flushing, for example. Or firefighting is another example of unbilled and unmetered use. There will also be other examples of maybe unbilled but metered uses, your own district's facilities, maybe some grandfathered in customers or some weird exemptions. You'll also have to account for city use and acknowledge how you've made arrangements with other municipal accounts. Other authorized consumption in all of these three different forms allow you some flexibility, but we encourage you to think through each of these examples and then some to understand where is the best place for you to put this volume. The unbilled volumes are important to acknowledge because we're not generating revenue from them. And the unmetered volumes are important to acknowledge because we have to take those with a bigger grain of salt given that we don't have a meter behind those numbers. So at this point, we've been able to assess our water supplied volume. We've determined all of the volume that is input or enters our distribution system over the course of the year. We've investigated our billing database. We've assessed these other volumes of known uses that have been authorized and may have a bill or may have a meter, may not, but we've done our job at estimating all of those unmetered uses and allocating all of our authorized consumption to these different categories. So with those two big volume determinations, water supplied and authorized consumption, we can now determine what of our water supplied is not in authorized consumption. We do a simple subtraction, water supplied minus all of that authorized consumption, and we've got our first estimation of our total water loss volume. It's now our job to break water losses down into the component parts of real losses and apparent losses. As you know, a total water loss volume is instructive in that it's a measure of water that is not generating new revenue, that is not put to authorized use, But beyond that, it's going to be much more instructive, it's going to be much more useful to understand which types of water loss are happening in your system. And to do that, we have to do a bit more poking and prodding to understand and categorize apparent losses apart from real losses. So here we are back to the water balance graphic, and you'll see that within the water loss category, which we've estimated at this point, we want to separate apparent losses from real losses. So first we're going to focus on estimating the volume of apparent loss. So apparent losses, as a quick definition reminder, apparent losses is all of the water that does reach an end user, is used by a customer, but it's not registered or properly tracked. This means that you're not generating revenue for it, so it is an accounting loss of sorts. You do your job as a utility, you deliver water, but for whatever reason, it doesn't translate to a bill and it's not paid for, so it's a financial loss. Apparent losses are often referred to as paper losses because, again, the physical volume reaches a customer, but our mechanisms for tracking that water and our mechanisms for getting paid for that water break down in some respect. That's important because when it comes to solving apparent losses or reducing them, it's important to acknowledge that it's a question of money recovery and revenue recovery. So reducing apparent losses, we could do that by switching out our meters to make them more accurate. We could do that by monitoring and trying to reduce theft more aggressively. We could do that by reducing the error in some of our billing processes. All of these options don't create any new water. There's no new water that's recovered or saved. Instead, we're just generating more revenue for the water that we successfully deliver. A huge benefit and super worthwhile, but this is going to be very different from our solutions of leakage. Apparent losses come in a variety of different forms, and the questions we're asking ourselves is how much water is delivered but not registered nor paid for. So what are we losing in revenue for the water that we do deliver but we lose track of? The three ways we lose track of water: the first is because our instruments aren't reading all of the water that goes through them. So there's a registration inaccuracy. For example, I as a customer use 10 units of water, but my meter is running a bit slow, and it reports to the meter reader that I only used 8 units of water. That difference between my actual use and what my meter suggests I used is an apparent loss. It's water that my meter did not capture, and so therefore I do not pay. That 2 gallons is what we're talking about when I say an apparent loss due to customer meter inaccuracies. It's water, it's a volume that I used, but I didn't pay for. A similar thing happens in a much more obvious way for theft or unauthorized consumption. A customer is intentionally using water without paying for it, so we don't generate revenue. And lastly, there are systemic data handling errors. These are issues of billing processing or introduction of error from the meter read to a bill generation that loses track of some volume such that we aren't paid for it. Once we estimate all of those different sources of apparent loss, and we can estimate those especially well when we have meter testing results and have engaged in understanding our meter's accuracy. But once we do know all of those elements, customer meter inaccuracies, we've estimated theft, and we've estimated how much error we introduce in our billing, then we finally have the opportunity to reduce that apparent loss volume from our total water loss volume, and we have an estimate of real loss. As you can see, we isolate our real loss volume only after we determine and calculate all these other volumes. We start with water supplied, we subtract authorized consumption, we have water losses at that point. at which point we subtract further from water losses our estimation of apparent losses to determine our leakage. As you can tell, our leakage estimation is directly dependent on all of those other calculations. And that's why we're so concerned with the data accuracy of those other determinations, because they're going to directly impact the accuracy of our leakage estimation in the end. Real losses are often referred to as physical losses or leakage, and real losses are the result of any and all infrastructure failures where water is withdrawn from our distribution system. We call them leaks, we call them seeps, we call them breaks. Sometimes they're referred to in terms of urgency, emergency breaks versus sort of routine repairs. All of it, no matter its urgency or size or flow rate, all of it qualifies as a real loss because it's water that is tangibly withdrawn from our distribution system and does not get delivered to a customer, nor is it used for any of our other authorized uses. As we know, we don't like leakage. This lady particularly doesn't like leakage. She's lost her car to a sinkhole, and this is one of many consequences of leakage, a particularly acute one, but nonetheless we acknowledge that there are a lot of costs associated with leakage. Not only do we lose water that is not put to beneficial use, it's not paid for, nor is it used for any good purpose, it's just lost to our surroundings. But there are risks associated with leakage that we want to acknowledge and contain as best as we can. It's also important to acknowledge, especially in California during a time of drought, that when we have a volume of real loss, that's an opportunity. It represents a potential savings. If we reduce real loss, we're creating an additional resource that we could supply to our customers. So supply side conservation, this area of reducing leakage and reducing our losses in our system of supply, actually frees up some resource. It actually allows us to then defer what used to be leakage to customers, and that can be really powerful in an environment of constrained supply. Next up, we've got a continuation of the New Learner recorded content, and Will Jernigan is going to guide us through some specifics of how to use the free water audit software, how to translate these concepts and methodology basics into the actual software spreadsheet. And he's going to introduce a discussion of data validity grading, some of those concepts of uncertainty and how we reflect on our data sources. He's going to go into the specifics of where that is communicated in the water audit software, how you select a certain score. And lastly, he'll address how to prep for our next point of interaction, our Wave 2 work sessions on the phone. Lastly, thank you so much. Thanks for attending, whether in review or whether in catch-up. Appreciate you tuning in to this recorded content for new learners. And if you have any questions, I'd encourage you to go to our super great website, the www.californiawaterloss.org. That's where we're compiling all the information you'll need to know about where we are in the program, what we've done, what our plans look like in the next couple months, and how you should prepare. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to us at waterlosscontrolcollaborative@gmail.com, and we look forward to hearing from you and catching you on our Wave 2 activity coming soon.